Boston Harbor, Massachusetts, June 1919. A young Japanese naval officer stood at the edge of a steel pier, watching an endless procession of cargo vessels glide through the morning fog. Commander Isoroku Yamamoto, barely 35 years old, had traveled 7,000 miles from Tokyo to study at Harvard University, but it was not the classrooms that would change his understanding of war. It was this, the docks, the shipyards, the factories that stretched along the American coast like a beating industrial heart, pumping out vessels with a speed and efficiency that defied everything he had been taught about naval power. Yamamoto had arrived in America as a rising star in the Imperial Japanese Navy. He had fought at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, where Japan had crushed the Russian fleet and announced itself as a modern military power. He had lost 2 fingers on his left hand in that battle, a permanent reminder of Japan's greatest naval victory. Now, 14 years later, he stood in a nation that seemed to operate under entirely different rules of possibility. The United States was not just wealthy, it was not simply large. It was something Yamamoto had never encountered before, something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. It was a country that could turn raw materials into finished warships faster than Japan could conceive of building them. He spent his first weeks in Boston walking the waterfront, notebook in hand, observing the rhythm of American commerce. Stevedores moved in organized chaos. Cranes swung tons of cargo with mechanical precision. Ships arrived, unloaded, and departed with a regularity that suggested something close to mass production. This was peacetime. This was America not even trying. And yet the scale of it dwarfed anything Yamamoto had seen in Japan, where every ship was a months-long project, every vessel a precious resource carefully husbanded. The young commander enrolled at Harvard, ostensibly to study English and American culture, but his real education happened in the oil fields of California, the steel mills of Pittsburgh, the shipyards of Newport News. He traveled across the continent with a singular obsession, cataloging America's industrial capacity the way other officers might study enemy fortifications. He saw wheat fields stretching to the horizon in Kansas. He watched automobiles roll off assembly lines in Detroit, one every few minutes, a concept so foreign to Japanese manufacturing it seemed almost magical. He toured refineries where crude oil was transformed into aviation fuel, lubricants, heating oil, gasoline, each drop accounted for, each barrel destined for an economy that consumed resources at a rate Japan could never hope to match. But it was the shipyards that truly unnerved him. Yamamoto visited the Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company in Virginia, where he watched workers construct a battleship using techniques that seemed to compress time itself. American yards were not building ships the way Japan did, one at a time, with craftsmen fitting each plate by hand. They were manufacturing them. Components arrived prefabricated. Welding had begun to replace riveting. The entire process operated with the efficiency of a factory, producing automobiles, not warships. The implications were staggering. If America could build merchant vessels this quickly, what could it do if it turned this capacity toward military production? Yamamoto returned to Japan in 1921 with a report that his superiors did not want to hear. He told them that the United States possessed 17 times Japan's national income, that American steel production exceeded Japan's by a factor of 5, that the United States produced more oil in a single day than Japan could extract in an entire year. He warned them that in any prolonged conflict, Japan's navy would be overwhelmed not by superior tactics or braver sailors, but by simple mathematics. America could replace losses faster than Japan could inflict them. His warnings were dismissed. The Japanese military establishment, flush with victory over Russia and confident in its spiritual superiority, believed that will could overcome material disadvantage. They believed that Japanese pilots, trained to perfection, could defeat larger numbers of American aviators. They believed that the warrior spirit of the samurai, channeled through modern weapons, would prevail against a nation they viewed as soft, materialistic, distracted by luxury and comfort. Yamamoto knew better. He had seen the factories, he had counted the ships, he had done the mathematics, and the mathematics were merciless. In 1925, Yamamoto returned to America for a second tour of duty, this time as naval attaché at the Japanese embassy in Washington. He was now a captain, older, more senior, but no less obsessed with understanding American capacity. He traveled again, visiting oil fields in Texas, watching workers drill into the earth and pull up crude oil that seemed to flow in inexhaustible quantities. He toured shipyards that had expanded since his last visit, their capacity grown, their techniques refined. He played bridge with American naval officers, using the card games to study how they thought, how they calculated risk, how they approached problems. He found them competent but complacent, confident in their nation's power, but not particularly interested in war. This, too, worried him. A sleeping giant was dangerous precisely because it did not know its own strength. The Admiral who emerged from these American sojourns was a contradiction. Yamamoto loved many things about the United States. He enjoyed American movies, appreciated American efficiency, respected American engineering. He had developed a taste for bridge, a game he played with ruthless skill. He had learned to speak fluent English, which he maintained throughout his life, but he also harbored no illusions about what would happen if Japan went to war with this country. He calculated that Japan might succeed for 6 months, perhaps a year, striking first and striking hard while America mobilized. After that, the outcome was inevitable. American industry would awaken, the factories would retool, the shipyards would multiply, and Japan would be crushed beneath a tidal wave of steel and fuel and ammunition that it could never hope to match. By the late 1930s, Yamamoto had become one of the Imperial Navy's most senior officers. He opposed war with the United States at every opportunity. He argued against the tripartite pact with Germany and Italy, believing it would only antagonize America. He fought against the hardliners in the army who believed Japan could seize the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia without provoking an American response. He was fighting a losing battle. The Japanese military had committed to a path of expansion, driven by a desperate need for oil, rubber, and raw materials that the home islands could not provide. The United States had responded with escalating economic pressure, culminating in a full oil embargo in August 1941. This was the nightmare scenario Yamamoto had feared. Japan now faced a choice. It could back down, abandon its ambitions in China and Southeast Asia, and submit to American economic dominance, or it could go to war while it still had fuel in its tanks. The decision was made at the highest levels. Japan would strike, and when the military establishment turned to Yamamoto to devise a strategy, he gave them the only plan that had any chance of success, however slim. He would launch a surprise attack on the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, crippling it before war was even declared. He would give Japan 6 months to seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, the rubber plantations of Malaya, the resources it needed to sustain a war economy. He would gamble that a series of devastating early victories might convince America to negotiate a settlement rather than commit to a long, grinding conflict. He knew it was unlikely to work. He suspected it would fail, but it was the only strategy that offered any hope at all. November 1941. Imperial Japanese Navy Headquarters, Tokyo. Admiral Yamamoto sat in a conference room with the naval staff, presenting his plan for the Pearl Harbor attack. The room was thick with cigarette smoke and tension. Some officers believed the plan was brilliant. Others thought it was suicidal. Yamamoto was characteristically blunt. He told them he could guarantee a tough fight for the first 6 months. After that, he had no confidence whatsoever. If the war dragged on for 2 or 3 years, Japan would lose. The mathematics were unavoidable. The United States produced more steel than Japan could use in a decade. American oil reserves were effectively unlimited compared to Japan's desperate dependence on imports. The American economy was 7 times larger. The American population was twice as large. And perhaps most terrifying of all, America had slack in its economy. The Great Depression had left factories idle, workers unemployed, capacity unused. In wartime, all of that would be activated. Japan was already operating at maximum capacity. It had no reserves, no slack, no margin for error. The attack on Pearl Harbor unfolded on December 7th, 1941, exactly as Yamamoto had planned. Japanese carrier aircraft struck the American fleet in 2 waves, sinking 4 battleships, damaging 4 more, destroying nearly 200 aircraft. It was a tactical masterpiece, executed with precision and courage. And it was, from a strategic perspective, the worst mistake Japan could possibly have made. The attack united American public opinion instantly. Isolationism evaporated overnight. The sleeping giant that Yamamoto had warned about, the industrial colossus that had seemed content to watch the world burn from across 2 oceans, was now awake and enraged. Yamamoto spent the day after Pearl Harbor in apparent depression while his staff celebrated. He knew what was coming. He had seen it. He had measured it. He had walked through the shipyards and counted the slipways and calculated the ratios of production. The 6 months he had promised was optimistic. The Americans would rebuild faster than he had dared to hope. And they did. On December 30th, 1941, less than 4 weeks after Pearl Harbor, the first Liberty ship rolled out of the Bethlehem Fairfield Shipyard in Baltimore. The SS Patrick Henry was not a beautiful vessel. President Roosevelt himself called it dreadful-looking, an ugly duckling of a ship. But it was exactly what America needed. The Liberty ship was designed for mass production. It was welded rather than riveted, assembled from prefabricated sections that arrived at the shipyard ready to install. It used a simple reciprocating steam engine because turbines were in short supply. It sacrificed speed and elegance for one thing. It could be built fast. The first Liberty ships took about 8 months to complete. This was already faster than conventional shipbuilding, but it was not fast enough. American shipyards, learning as they went, began to refine their processes. They broke construction down into modules. They set up assembly line systems. They hired and trained tens of thousands of new workers, many of them women who had never worked in heavy industry before. By 1943, the median construction time for a Liberty ship had dropped to 39 days. Some yards were completing ships in less than 2 weeks. The record was set by the SS Robert E. Peary, launched just 4 days and 15 hours after her keel was laid. This was not normal shipbuilding. This was industrial magic, the kind of production capacity that made the mathematics of war shift decisively in one direction. But Liberty ships were just the beginning. America was simultaneously building destroyers, cruisers, battleships, submarines, and most critically, aircraft carriers. The Essex-class carriers were the backbone of the American naval resurgence in the Pacific. These were fleet carriers, large, fast, capable of carrying 90 aircraft each. The first Essex-class carrier, the USS Essex herself, was laid down in April 1941, before Pearl Harbor. She was scheduled for completion in April 1944. That timeline was accelerated. The ship was completed in December 1942, just 13 months after Pearl Harbor. The average build time for an Essex-class carrier during the war was 18 to 20 months. The fastest were completed in 15 months. By the end of the war, 24 Essex-class carriers had been built. 14 of them saw combat. Not a single one was sunk by enemy action, though several sustained heavy damage. Yamamoto watched this production surge with mounting horror. His intelligence officers brought him reports of new American ships entering service every week. Liberty ships by the hundreds, destroyers by the dozens, carriers arriving so quickly that the American fleet was growing even as it fought. The Battle of Midway in June 1942, exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor, marked the turning point Yamamoto had predicted. The Japanese Navy lost 4 fleet carriers in a single day, the core of its striking power. These were irreplaceable losses. Japan could build new carriers, but it would take years. America had already built replacements for its Pearl Harbor losses and was building more. The industrial mathematics that Yamamoto had tried to explain to his superiors were now playing out in real time, and they were every bit as merciless as he had warned. The production numbers told the story. Between 1941 and 1945, American shipyards built approximately 5,500 vessels for the Maritime Commission and the Navy. This included 2,700 Liberty ships, each capable of carrying 10,000 tons of cargo. It included 500 escort carriers, small carriers built on merchant hulls, produced so quickly that they were nicknamed Kaiser's coffins after industrialist Henry Kaiser, who specialized in rapid production. It included 175 Fletcher-class destroyers, built in an average of 8 months. It included those 24 Essex-class fleet carriers, the ships that would dominate the Pacific War. By 1944, the United States was launching ships faster than Germany could sink them. In the Pacific, American carriers outnumbered Japanese carriers by increasingly absurd ratios. The final major naval battle of the war, the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, saw 3 Japanese carriers among 67 ships facing an American fleet of 300 vessels, including 35 carriers. The battle was not close. The Japanese Navy ceased to exist as a fighting force, but shipbuilding was only part of the story. America's aircraft production was even more staggering. In 1941, before Pearl Harbor, American factories produced about 19,000 aircraft. In 1944, at the peak of production, they produced 96,000 aircraft, an average of more than 260 planes per day. The Ford Motor Company built a factory at Willow Run, Michigan, specifically to produce B-24 Liberator bombers. These were complicated aircraft, 4 engines, more than 1 million parts. Willow Run produced one every 63 minutes at peak efficiency. Nearly 7,000 B-24s came out of that single factory. Japanese aircraft production never came close. Japan built approximately 76,000 aircraft during the entire war. The United States built 300,000, but the numbers only told part of the story. American aircraft were constantly being improved, newer models with better engines, heavier armament, longer range. The F-6F Hellcat fighter, introduced in 1943, had a kill ratio of 19-1 against Japanese aircraft. The Japanese Zero, brilliant when the war began, was obsolete by 1943, and Japan lacked the industrial capacity to replace it with something better. Japanese pilots, initially among the best in the world, were killed faster than they could be replaced. Training was cut because Japan could not afford the fuel. By 1944, Japanese naval aviators were being sent into combat with less than half the training hours their predecessors had received. They were flying inferior aircraft with inadequate preparation against American pilots who had fuel to train, spare parts to maintain their aircraft, and new planes rolling off assembly lines every hour. Yamamoto did not live to see the end. In April 1943, American intelligence intercepted a Japanese radio transmission detailing his inspection tour of bases in the Solomon Islands. The message was encoded, but the Americans had broken Japanese naval codes. They knew exactly where Yamamoto would be, when he would arrive, and what aircraft he would be flying. The decision to intercept and kill him was made at the highest levels. On April 18, 1943, 18 American P-38 Lightning fighters flew a long-range intercept mission to the skies over Bougainville. They shot down 2 Japanese bombers. One of them carried Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. He died in the jungle, still strapped into his seat, his samurai sword at his side. He was 59 years old. He never saw Japan's defeat, but he had predicted it with mathematical precision. The final 18 months of the war bore out everything Yamamoto had feared. American industrial production continued to accelerate even as German and Japanese production plateaued and then collapsed under bombing and resource shortages. The United States was producing so much material that it was supplying not just its own forces, but also the British and Soviet armies. Lend-lease shipments to the Soviet Union alone included 14,000 aircraft, 7,000 tanks, and over 400,000 trucks. This was essentially spare capacity, equipment the United States could afford to give away, because its factories were producing more than American forces could use. Japanese oil supplies, always precarious, collapsed entirely. American submarines and aircraft systematically destroyed Japan's merchant fleet, cutting off the flow of oil from the Dutch East Indies. By 1945, the Japanese Navy was largely confined to port for lack of fuel. Japanese aircraft were grounded, training programs were cancelled, the military was reduced to desperate expedients, converting sugar and pine root into substitute fuels that barely worked. The same Imperial Navy that had struck Pearl Harbor with such devastating effect was now a ghost fleet, magnificent ships sitting idle because there was no fuel to run them. The Manhattan Project represented the final proof of American industrial dominance. The development of the atomic bomb required an investment of approximately $2 billion, a sum equivalent to building 1,000 Liberty ships. It required uranium enrichment facilities that consumed more electricity than entire cities. It required scientific talent drawn from across the world, laboratory facilities built from scratch, test sites carved out of deserts. Japan could never have undertaken such a project. Neither could Germany. The Soviet Union barely managed it with American technical assistance. Only the United States had the combination of wealth, industrial capacity, scientific infrastructure, and secure geography to pursue such an ambitious program while simultaneously fighting a two-ocean war. As historian Paul Kennedy later wrote, America could afford to fund one of the greatest scientific endeavors in history, largely from the leftovers of its war effort. The bombing of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and Nagasaki 3 days later, brought the war to its conclusion. The bombs themselves were terrible weapons, but they were also symbols of something larger. They represented what Yamamoto had understood in 1919 when he first walked the docks of Boston Harbor. They represented the gulf between Japan's limited industrial capacity and America's seemingly inexhaustible productive power. Japan had fought with courage and skill, but it had been fighting against mathematics, and mathematics always won. In the basement war room beneath the Imperial Palace, Japanese military leaders spent the days after Hiroshima coming to terms with what Yamamoto had tried to tell them years earlier. Intelligence officer Colonel Hideaki Sato presented production figures that were staggering in their implications. America had produced 88,000 tanks to Japan's 6,000. America had built 41 fleet carriers to Japan's 15. American steel production exceeded Japan's by factors so large they were difficult to comprehend. The industrial capacity that had seemed like mere numbers in 1941 had been transformed into fleets, armies, air forces, weapons that overwhelmed Japanese resistance through sheer mass. The warrior spirit that Japanese leaders had believed would overcome material disadvantage had proven insufficient. Courage could not sink a Liberty ship. Determination could not shoot down a B-29 bomber. Spiritual strength could not replace aircraft carriers that had been sunk and could not be rebuilt. The lesson of Admiral Yamamoto's warnings extended far beyond World War II. It was a lesson about the nature of modern warfare, about the way industrial capacity determined outcomes in conflicts between great powers. It was a lesson about the danger of underestimating an opponent's economic strength. It was a lesson about the limits of tactical brilliance when strategic fundamentals were unfavorable. Yamamoto had given Japan its 6 months. He had struck Pearl Harbor with devastating effect. He had won every battle he could win, and none of it mattered because he had been right from the beginning. Japan could not outproduce the United States. It could not replace losses as fast as America could inflict them. It could not sustain a long war against an opponent with 5 times its steel production, 7 times its coal production, 80 times its automobile production, and effectively unlimited oil reserves. The story of Admiral Yamamoto is not a story of villainy. He was not a warmonger who sought conflict with America. He was a realist who understood the mathematics of power and tried desperately to prevent a war he knew Japan would lose. When his warnings were ignored, he devised the best strategy he could, knowing it would probably fail. When it did fail, exactly as he had predicted, he did not live to say he told them so. He died in the jungle, shot down by American fighters, guided to their target by American intelligence, killed by the same industrial and technological superiority he had spent his life trying to explain to leaders who would not listen. The shipyards he had visited in 1919 and 1925, the factories he had toured, the oil fields he had studied, all of them had done exactly what he feared. They had awakened. They had mobilized. They had turned American industrial capacity toward the production of war material with a speed and efficiency that exceeded even his pessimistic calculations. The sleeping giant had been roused, and its response had been overwhelming. Not because American soldiers were braver than Japanese soldiers, not because American generals were more skilled than Japanese generals, but because America could build 10 ships for every one Japan could produce, and that ratio made victory inevitable. The harbor where Yamamoto had stood in 1919, watching merchant vessels come and go, was still there. The shipyards were still there, though many had closed after the war, their emergency production capacity no longer needed. But the lesson remained. In modern warfare between industrial powers, production capacity was destiny. Tactics mattered, strategy mattered, leadership and morale and training all mattered. But underneath it all, the nation that could build more ships, produce more aircraft, refine more fuel, and forge more steel would win. Yamamoto had understood this truth 30 years before Pearl Harbor. He had tried to explain it to his superiors. They had not listened, and 65 million barrels of oil, 200,000 lives, and 4 years of brutal warfare later, they learned what he had tried to teach them. You cannot defeat an enemy whose shipyards produce faster than your forces can sink ships. You cannot win a war of attrition against an opponent whose factories work faster than your armies can destroy them. You cannot overcome industrial mathematics with courage alone, no matter how fierce your warriors, no matter how brilliant your tactics, no matter how strong your spirit. The admiral who saw America's shipyards knew the truth from the beginning. Japan could never win. The only question was how much it would lose before acknowledging what Yamamoto had calculated with such terrible clarity on those walks along Boston Harbor in the summer of 1919? The answer, as it turned out, was everything.